From the end of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century, women had little power or influence. Women were told that their duty was to be housewives. People with mental disabilities were treated poorly as well, having little agency. The two marginalized groups often tied into each other, with the stereotype of female hysteria leading to women who were sent to insane asylums for bizarre, sexist reasons being unable to defend themselves. Burgeoning women's rights and suffrage movements led to the beginnings of challenging these stereotypes, but women were largely relegated to an inferior role.
Elizabeth Cochrane, better known by her pen name Nellie Bly, was a journalist in the late 19th century. During this time, journalism was seen as a man's job. Nevertheless, Nellie Bly proceeded and began her career writing for the Pittsburgh Dispatch, calling for treating girls the same as boys. Bly was a strong advocate for women's advancement, encouraging women stepping into male-dominated fields, particularly journalism. Wanting to write pieces geared towards both men and women, Bly began looking for a paper that would allow her to write more serious, hard-hitting stories. In 1886, she moved to New York City and sought to write for the New York World, one of the leading newspapers in the country. In 1887, the editor of the New York World challenged Bly to investigate one of New York's most notorious mental hospitals, Blackwell's Island. Bly accepted this challenge and decided to feign mental illness to gain admission and expose the treatment of patients. From her experience, a series of articles were published under the title 10 Days in a Madhouse.
10 Days in a Madhouse worked to expose horrific conditions in the mental health care system, leading to reform and inspiring women to step out of their stereotypical roles and pursue male-dominated professions.
10 Days in a Madhouse exposed tragedy that lay in its deplorable treatment. Blackwell's Island held many different sorts of hospitals, including the Metropolitan Hospital, City Hospital, and Goldwater Hospital, a penitentiary, workhouse, lunatic asylum, and many almshouses. People who stood out as physically or mentally disabled or were impoverished were cast out of society. Blackwell's Island, a catastrophe of its time, served as a place to keep those who didn't fit the status quo.
There were very many women who were imprisoned here because they participated in the suffrage movement. Yeah, I mean, a lot of women were imprisoned here for what we would now call human rights violations. You know, a woman wanted the right to vote, and you couldn't do that. And if you protested, you went to jail.
After extensive practice, Bly's dramatics proved convincing, and she was declared positively demented. Bly was easily committed to this asylum with little questioning. At the asylum, there was almost no chance to prove one's sanity, and doctors put little effort in during rushed examinations.
Would perceive someone to be mad. And for her, of course, that was hysterics, the repeating of terms, where are my lost trunks? Where are my trunks? You know, she had that sort of wild-eyed response while she was in the boarding house, making enough of a sense of fear to the people who were there that the matron felt obliged to call authorities to cart her away. So I think it played very much in what you describe as hysterics, and I think it's true, would have spoken to why immigrant women who didn't speak English were taken to the asylum, because people couldn't understand them and they would become extremely agitated.
Once she gained admittance, Bly observed the negligence prevalent throughout the asylum. Low-quality food was served to patients, such as nearly inedible bread and prunes for dinner, and Bly often ended up going without food for the day because of poor quality or theft. Hygienic conditions were deplorable as well. Freezing baths with reused filthy water and abrasive scrubbing were the norm, and disease spread easily due to the unhygienic sharing. However, patients received no treatment for sickness and were left to die if they were to contract an illness. For the approximate 1,600 women, there were only 16 doctors. Bly also noted the architectural folly of the asylum. It was impossible to escape if there were to be a fire in the building, leading to the inevitable death of the patients. Blackwell's Island was an unsafe environment, and no one would care if the patients were to die. The insidious nature of the asylum lay not just in negligence, but outright cruelty. Bly and other patients suffered violent punishments from the nurses, such as beatings, chokings, and malicious withholding of privileges or necessities. Although not stated in Bly's work, it is believed that many of these women deemed insane were also sexually abused by the asylum staff members. Not only was the treatment of patients horrifying, many were hopeless, knowing that they would never see true freedom again, as once being admitted to a mental asylum, it was near impossible to leave. Nellie Bly herself had a difficult time leaving, and the New York World had to hire an attorney to get Nellie off the island.
The shock value of Bly's story directed lots of attention to the mental health system. She did expose the issue of how mentally disabled people were being treated, and the city of New York appropriated $1 million more to institutions a year. Also, the mental asylum was moved off of Blackwell's Island and onto the mainland. New York responded in a positive manner, as a grand jury was assembled in order to address the issues that Bly exposed in her story, leading to improved conditions for people in mental hospitals with higher funding.
Were there short-term impacts from 10 days in a madhouse? Well, yes, there were. As we know, the horror of her story over 2 weeks on a full page of the New York World in 1887 in the fall caused such a sensation both in New York and across the country that a grand jury was called. They went to visit the asylum directly. Of course, a lot had been cleaned up from the time Nellie had been there until the visit took place, but still it was pretty evident how dilapidated the facility was, and indeed there was a very large appropriation made for most of the public facilities on Blackwell's Island, which was, of course, the home of the cancer spots of modern Manhattan, including the asylum. So yes, there were short-term impacts.
Bly helped to open journalism and hard-hitting news to women, creating an image of the new American girl, that is, a woman who made her own path or career. Nellie Bly inspired other women to step outside their expected roles as housewives. She broke through the sphere of thought that women should remain in their households and leave jobs, such as journalism, to men. She blazed the way for women journalists, inspiring other women to take action and stand up for what they believe. At the time in particular, she helped encourage the suffrage movement. Nellie Bly revolutionized the field of journalism by pioneering new techniques unknown before, investigative journalism. Nellie Bly became known as a stunt girl, that is, a heroic female reporter who exposes wrongs in society, unheard of at this time. After her writing, many journalists, including female journalists, were provoked by her work and inspired to write in the same manner.
But she did come to personify a lot of the way women were finding ways to move ahead in those days.
Therefore, this sparked a movement of investigative journalism. Bly's investigative journalism is used today to address issues in the world. Bly generated a new form of journalism, which is seen as a fundamental of journalism written today, over a century later. Bly achieved her goal of appearing on the front pages of newspapers, no longer in the women's section, where stereotypically women's works were published. This was unheard of for the time, for a woman's work to be on the front page of a newspaper. Bly continues to inspire girls today, creating a lasting triumph in her tireless work to expose tragedy.
Nellie Bly, bring the broom along. We'll sweep the kitchen clean, my dear, and have a little song.